I'm back with
All right.
another episode of Semi-Pro. Today, I'm talking to Josh Micks, also known as Just Micks, and he is, of course, the current analyst for the new Cloud9 Colossus, and he's here with me. Obviously, we got a bit of rapport going since we've been doing server time together for some time. For Cloud9, he's been working for them since January. I'm sure he had hopes and dreams to move in with the team and bunk up with them and say hi to all of the new people, and then coronavirus hit, and now we're all fucked. But suffice it to say, he's been doing some work for them. He's got a bit of a backstory in the NA scene as well. He's been the coach of Space Station Gaming and almost a coach of eUnited. We'll get to that a little bit later on. So,
Almost.
yeah. So he's joining me here to talk about a bit about his career, a bit about the landscape in North America, but also a little bit about how things have been shifting, especially given the pandemic, but also just in the past couple of years towards a more integrated with European descent and stuff like that, where we have rosters that are a bit more mixed. So, given that that's the situation, I guess the first a topic we could talk about is essentially how you got to where you are right now. I mean, you are essentially an analyst for one of the hottest teams, at least in terms of what people's attentions are and the pedigree of the organization as well. So is this a situation, a position that you actually had sought after initially? Because obviously, given your coaching history in the past, I'm curious if you always wanted to be more of an analytical role or more of like in the game, really looking at the details, or if maybe this is something like a sort of a stepping stone into where you want to be in the future. How do you sort of take apart or rate your current position? And is this something you always wanted to do?
Yeah, like getting into CS, like I knew that like kind of like the door would be open for me in terms of like the analyst role, in terms of getting my foot in the door into the scene and like having value straight away, and being able to climb my way up to a decent level. I definitely do see it as more of like a thing that I do eventually want to end up coaching. I don't know like when that would be. I don't know when the right opportunity would come for that, but that definitely is kind of like my end goal. Like you know something I'm so passionate about, and that's been kind of rough in the pandemic is like you know the the actual events themselves, and competing on stages, and the fans, and you know the crowds and everything. So that's kind of like what really brings my passion for everything. So I definitely want to kind of keep building myself up to eventually being one of the best coaches in the scene, and competing.
Well, being on the stage behind the players in the middle of a LAN as well must be a pretty
Mhm.
alluring prospect. You were referencing the LAN
Yeah.
environment, the fans being there, the crowd being there, the stakes being sort of actualized in front of you with the people in the stadium watching your team play. Is that one of the main reasons why you're looking to be a coach in the future, or do you also see a lot of value in like not just the prestige, not just the element of being able to deliver results on a LAN environment, but also the like essentially what I'm asking here is like what do you rate about the position of a coach that is sort of where you want to be versus where you are right now? Like what about being a coach versus being an analyst is something that you think is so alluring?
Yeah, definitely more than just competing on stages, but like having that control over a team when you're the coach, it's like so different from being in the coach role to being in the analyst role, and like in terms of like kind of like the say you have in a team and like in the control you have in a team, obviously. So like the main thing that's a learning for me from a coach role especially is just kind of like from a sense of um I also have Asperger's, so it like kind of makes the analyst role kind of tough at times because I'm not too sure where to go with things, and I'm not too sure how to help the coach itself, and how to help the other players. Whereas with a coach, if I'm kind of like kind of like kind of the one that has to say and like kind of like the kind of control over something, I feel it's a lot easier and more natural for me to have impact, and it's a lot more motivating, like a lot more consistently motivating, and a lot more. It feels like the stakes are consistently a lot higher and a lot more real to you. A lot more affect you a lot more. So that I really just love that feeling. I love feeling super involved. I love feeling like within the six of the team, competing, having that control, having a lot of say over our play style and what we're doing. That's like the main appeal for me to eventually.
What you're alluding to, I think, is an important point to touch on when you compare the role of an analyst to the role of a coach, or even a coach who's like a coach in terms of their position, but ends up being more of the analyst role. Maybe they don't have as much control as what you're discussing here. And one of the things that I think is really important as a distinction to draw upon is when you're dealing with the position of an analyst, especially if you find it sometimes difficult to communicate the ideas that you're having, it's going to be very challenging to give enough of a reason to justify maybe looking into that, or maybe you don't even have the say anyway, and all you can do is put forth your best case and hope that they buy it. But ultimately, maybe they aren't going to be able to take that on board, or maybe they just won't conceptualize it as something that they should be looking at to the same degree. So would you say, looking at some of the coaches that are already in there, I mean, there's some talk, a bit of behind the scenes talk about, like, for example, Peacemaker over in Mad Lions, where he's had essentially a history of if he disagrees with the IGL, there's going to be some issues that might result in one of the essentially a decision being made to drop one or the other. Do you have any coaches that sort of exemplify the kind of style that you would be bringing to the table as a coach, that you would be looking to go about that way? Do you think that maybe there's something to be said about trying to make things work within any sort of personality conflicts? Anything you can speak on to that sort of situation where you see some coaches out there, you know some information from either behind the scenes or not, that make you think that, yeah, that coach is probably essentially the same style that I would be coaching or something similar to that?
Yeah, there's definitely like a few coaches that I think I kind of take after, or like I kind of especially look at, and I kind of look at even just on stage, like their mannerisms and like how they're talking to players and like how they're, just kind of like the general vibe they give off in their teams. Like Malik is someone that I respect a lot, and I have a lot of I have a lot of respect for. He's someone that I look at a lot to kind of see the things that he's doing, kind of like the things that G2 is doing. Kind of how they build their roster, how they how Malik just seems to have like there's a lot of stars on that team. He still seems to have proper control over the team. Working with even TC in the past was someone that did a really good job at like balancing being like kind of friendly in the team, having that kind of control, but also kicking people's ass, kicking people in the ass when you needed to, and getting them to work. And I think that's another thing that I take after a lot. And yeah, so like Malik is especially one that I look after, and Kassad is like especially like kind of like those like straightforward styles where there's not a lot of bullshit. You kind of have that control over, and you're friendly with everyone. You get along with everyone, but you try not to like favor other people over more. Or you try to, if someone's messing up, or you need to point something out, or you need to do something to keep the environment, the team right. Like they'll do it. They're not going to hesitate. Whereas with other coaches I've maybe worked with in the past, maybe we're all too focused on just kind of being friendly and didn't have that kind of sort of control and say in the team. And we're kind of looking more as like a six man, kind of like a buddy to the players more than a coach.
One of the things that you're referencing here is one of the sort of common denominators between Malik and Kassad, for example, are that they tend to coach the European-focused teams or the international teams, where maybe culturally speaking, the propensity for them to allow for the kind of no bullshit sort of style of communication is a little bit higher. Like they're willing to be a bit more partial to that compared to some of the backroom stories I've heard from North American teams where they might be a bit more on the emotional side in that respect.
Oh,
So
definitely, yeah.
so there's definitely places we can go to when it comes to this particular topic. But I wanted to call back a little bit to something that you talked about earlier, where you said that you had Asperger's. And for people who aren't familiar with what that actually means, in essence, in terms of the real world implications, is ultimately communication is harder for people who have to deal with that when they're trying to essentially figure out how to communicate their ideas, and maybe they can't always communicate them with all of the different bells and whistles that everybody else finds more natural. So given that that's a situation, plus that you're looking towards the coaches who are that no bullshit style, that don't essentially have to dress them up in the same way that we might have to more domestically here, do you think that might have something to do with your proclivity towards that? Do you think that maybe that one of the reasons why that you think you'd be so good at the no bullshit style is simply because that's essentially not all you've known, but one of the things that you've excelled at in theory is you've been able to cut straight through it just because of that? Do you think that has something to do with that why that would be your style?
Yeah, definitely. Like it kind of helps me to almost separate kind of how I view kind of like the five players in the team, kind of like them as like as a player and as a person, which obviously both have effects on the thing in the game. But I do feel like I'm able to kind of separate my whatever personalities I have towards people, or whatever emotions I have towards people. I feel like I'm able to like separate those really well based on the time that's needed. I don't feel too like stuck in certain ways for people. I feel like I'm able to fairly judge and fairly like I feel like I'm able to like even just go into like a team speak, and I feel like I'm able to pretty much read the room really well, like in terms of the atmosphere and the vibes that everyone is giving off. And so I feel like that really helps to kind of know like what the atmosphere in the team is, and maybe kind of like the motivation in the team, the confidence levels between each people, like how people are interacting between each other. And I think that's super beneficial to that kind of style of no bullshit, calling things out and just trying to keep things properly on track.
I won't pretend that the European Counter-Strike way is completely devoid of all drama and all sort of anything like that. Obviously, people who are following this Nico story have a great counterexample for that. But generally speaking, I think by and large, the European Counter-Strike scene does have less, depending on where you go, it is a bit regional, but there are less stories of rosters imploding because of personality differences than if you contrast that with the American history. So briefly touching on some of the stuff with Space Station Gaming and some of the stuff with eUnited, I was curious as to how you've had to deal with some of those difficulties where maybe those people don't have the same sort of, I guess, emotional or the ability to separate out the emotional and relationship based opinions that they might have versus what's actually happening as a qualitative analysis of a player in the game. So, can you give us some examples, maybe from when you were coaching, that sort of imply this sort of, I don't want to call it the European model, but something that's a little bit closer to the European model, where they are a little bit more factual. They are looking at stats, so they're also looking at impact. They're trying to understand it from many different facets instead of just the emotional one, just how this player makes me feel, just how comfortable I am, and all of the other things that seem to plague North America. And maybe you can even speak to whether or not this is 100% the case in North America, because it seems to be a bit of a narrative. So could you speak to how North American teams end up having those issues that are a little bit more based in emotional relationships between players as opposed to what the player is actually providing on the server?
Yeah, like Space Station was pre-Rogue for me, like before I joined Rogue with like MSL and Nico. So back then I hardly would even call myself a coach. Like I didn't really know what I was doing back then. That was kind of just a team of 5 friends, and they got along pretty well, but it wasn't like, definitely wasn't like a serious type of European, climb to the top type of team. It felt like at times. Um, but like even just like the main difference, like say like Rogue and United is like on Rogue, I actually wasn't paid on Rogue because Rogue wouldn't get MSL a coach or an analyst. They didn't want to pay for one for him at the time. And the kind of attitude in the team at that time was just, yeah, that sucks, but we just need to get on with it and get our results and work with what we have. And I really value that. I really value that style of just getting along with things. Things aren't always going to be perfect with your org, but you can't sit there and complain about it because it's just going to hurt the rest of the team and the environment for things that you have no control over. Whereas in eUnited, we kind of had a problem like after the minor, where like the team, they're kind of like the team hadn't gotten this housing yet, which they had said for some time, and like we didn't get a boot camp for the minor, and it's like, yeah, that kind of sucks. But like when one of the players is like messaging the manager that like if we don't have housing or boot camps, then it's unrealistic to expect any results. It's like it's such a different mindset, and that's so like harmful to a team and a team environment. Like that just creates excuses, and it creates it deflects blame from themselves, and trying to actually improve their own team, and just focusing on that process rather than on Rogue. It's just all right, we'll just focus on improving the team, getting better, controlling what we can't control, and then it was more blaming outside factors and letting those affect you a lot more, it felt like.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting as a bit of a jumping off point here is considering if you had to sort of give back a little bit of hindsight, looking at the experience with Rogue versus the experience with the United, and looking essentially at the sort of psychology of the team and the makeup there that they have. I'm curious as to how many of the players on either team. I mean, obviously, Rogue had some European players come in, so I'm curious as to how many of the players on the team ended up feeling that way, and maybe was it a response to like leadership within the team? So you're alluding to a certain player sending a message to the management over at United. Do you think that was a sentiment that was carried over from some of the veterans on the roster or some of the people who had just been around for, or do you think that it was almost like convergent evolution where they all came up with essentially the same opinion? Like how did it come to the point where they were sort of, how shall we say, wallowing in the fact that they were in a negative position, as opposed to trying to improve and make the most of what they had, which seems to be the case on Rogue?
Yeah, I think it builds from on Rogue. We kind of had that leadership from MSL. MSL was like the leader of the team. He's the guy that controls the roster. And he was the guy that was like, yeah, it sucks, but we need to keep going. We can't think about it too much. Let's focus on improving and playing. Whereas United really didn't even have any of those experienced players. They had 5 pretty inexperienced players that weren't like that loud voice for a team like MSL was. And, the coach A2Z also wasn't really doing that. He's kind of being more of, a friend for the other 6. So there was no one like having that voice and controlling them, and saying like, that sucks, but we need to carry on. We need to keep going with things. And, rather we just kind of, agree with them or just go along with the jokes or whatever, which, at the time, individually, those things don't really seem that harmful, complaining about those things or, constantly making jokes about housing and, not having boot camps. But when when it adds up and you keep doing it, it does affect the team environment, and people start to deflect blame from themselves, and they start to not focus on just improving as a team. And so when no one's like laying down the law, and like no one's like saying to cut that shit, and it just keeps going and just keeps going, then it's just gonna eventually spiral into a poor team environment where people are just blaming other people. So eUnited, it had 5 players that weren't very experienced, so no one was really doing that. And the one person on the team that was experienced, the coach, also wasn't doing it. So there was no voice controlling the team, it felt like, and controlling the environment to lead towards of a positive way.
Now, if we contrast this a little bit with the former C9 roster, that was obviously the previous ATK roster that had been picked up, I'm curious as to your take on the sort of psychological makeup of these players, because some of them are pretty young in that respect. Some of them were up-and-comers. I think a lot of them, generally speaking, were considered up-and-comers, although some of them had a bit more experience than others, like the ex-Bravado players, for example. So if we had to conceptualize the sort of makeup of those players, I'm curious as to your take on that, because one of the things that you alluded to there is when you don't have this sense that we can actually invest in this team, we can invest in trying to improve the team, people will start to play more for themselves to try to maybe pad their stats or look as appealing and alluring as possible for anybody else who might want to pick them up, so that they can essentially parlay their current position into a future position on another team. And I mean, in a way, it's understandable. They're kind of looking out for themselves. But when you lose faith in your current roster and your only resulting, action is to try to invest in yourself to the point where you can say, hey, look at me. I was on this team. It didn't work out, but my stats are still pretty good, so why don't you come pick me up? Maybe that's sort of a reading too far into the lines there, but that might be at least in the back of the players' minds, even subconsciously, that they have to kind of look out for themselves in that sense if they're not fully committed to the roster that they're in. So how would you say that that is different with the C9 roster? Because it does seem like they were more or less interested in staying together even once this Colossus was being put together by Henry G, and they had that obviously multi-million-dollar deal going on where they were buying players left and right and getting a very different approach to the roster and turning it into a multinational squad as opposed to the North American and South African squad that we had previously. So when the news broke essentially that those players weren't going to be in the roster, because initially Floppy wasn't even going to be in the new C9 roster, how do you think that those players handled it? Were they still looking to invest in the same kind of squad? Did they keep the faith in that sense? Did they have somebody sort of trying to keep them on the right track, or how would you characterize that?
I would kind of characterize like the old C9 squad as like it was like United, but with like a proper coach, like a proper leader. Tian, TC, someone. Obviously young. They're all super young, like 20 years old or so. Like they're all gonna have emotions. This is all like their first big org. Obviously, they're not used to like how things are typically done in a big org. All the content. All the other various side shit that you have to do. And it does get stressful. It does get annoying. But a lot of the players, I would say, they weren't like as. They definitely did kind of complain a lot, because it's just kind of typical of like young players, But the difference is having a coach that will be like, yeah, it sucks, but we need to get on with it. We just need to continue keeping the process in our team, and keeping the process in us. And that's why even when they were getting dropped from C9 initially, they all wanted to stick together, and they all wanted to look for a new org. And obviously, things haven't turned out exactly the way things would with like the scene being such a flux, Ricky going to with the EU team, but they did want to stay together, and I think that does come from having proper leadership, shutting down that shit, and having a proper voice when things aren't going so well in the team to keep things looking forward and moving forward rather than just shutting down.
If we go back in time to January when you were signed on to the C9 roster, this was before any confirmed reports of this new Colossus were coming in, obviously. So for a while, the C9 org seemed to be sticking with those players. What was your take when you were brought on board as an analyst for this position? What was your take on this roster? Did you see a lot of obvious ways where they might be able to improve, or was it more about like min-maxing smaller things? How would you sort of break down the roster back in January, if you can remember that far back? It does feel like it's been a couple years now.
Well, I was with them before that as well. I was with them so I left United, and then I was kind of working with them on ATK in kind of like a similar role when they went to. So I went to LA with them for EPL group stage, and then I actually went to Denmark with them when we went to EPL finals and beat North in G2. So I'd already had some experience working with them, obviously from Bravado back in the day as well. So it felt just kind of natural being there. I felt like I was natural working with Johnny and Tian, working with them again. Ricky, I'd already met back from the minor in United, so he was already one of my best friends, and same with Josh and MOTM, meeting them in LA. It was probably still the closest I've been with players on a team. So I felt pretty confident in the team. I felt like the roles in the team never quite made 100% perfect sense, just in terms of everyone as players. Like everyone, attitude and personality wise, I think was perfect. But I think just in terms of roles wise, I think it never was like 100% comfortable and fully fledged out. At least in my opinion, in terms of what I saw could be done. But yeah, I felt like when we first joined, I was kind of hoping to expand on what we had done in ATK, beating Orphan G2. Like I wanted to make playoffs at DreamHack Open. That was like one goal I think we should have been able to achieve, or winning another series, or at least taking a map from Astralis, or not getting shit on by NIP would have been nice in Poland. And then obviously we had our lands taken away, so I felt like online we did fine. We were kind of taking upsets off EG and Liquid, but we never were able to string together like an actual run to winning an event. So yeah, I felt like we kind of hit a hard ceiling at a certain point, and I think the only way to get past that would have been kind of drastically changing the roles, or like adding a 6-man or something like that. I think in terms of a 5-man lineup, and the roles we kind of currently had then, I think we did kind of hit our peak.
One of the things I'm curious about now is when the transition period comes in and C9 announces that they're going to be making the Colossus and all of the different moving parts start kicking in. I mean, you're still an analyst for C9 now that their new roster is in. So you've actually survived the sort of regime change, as it were, when the new people are coming in, Kassad and Henry G. So I'm curious as to how that happened, how that came about, because especially since you already had a prior history with the old C9 squad, the ATK squad back in the day. In some ways, it may have felt natural for those people to vouch for you. So C9 ends up picking you up as well because you have history with the org. Now we're talking about players who maybe you don't have history with, or you don't have as much history with, or maybe you have some opinions of, or you can break the roles down and figure out how they might be able to gel. But things are obviously a very different squad anyway. It's a very new look. So what would you say that your strengths were? Essentially, how did you convince C9 to keep you on, in a sense? Because in a way, just by virtue of you working with the old roster, doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to be brought on still with the new roster. Was it just, do you think it was a mixture of comfort and your own strengths as an analyst? Or how do you think that you were able to parlay your position from old C9 to new C9 as far as staying on as an analyst?
Yeah, I mean, in the past few months, I've grown like increasingly more confident in my abilities, and like I guess my skills as an analyst, is like weird as that sounds. But being able to read teams and stuff. But yeah, like I remember, it was like that morning we had like a meeting, and I figured I didn't have to be in it because it's usually just for like content and stuff. And then so like the meeting happens, and then like 45 minutes after, I see that like the team's getting dropped from C9, which is quite the news to suddenly see. And then so it's like, all right, I didn't like freak out or anything. It's just when you hear that, it's just all right. Like, what do you do from here? Like, what's the next step? And so I, messaged our GM. So like Henry's in the thing, so I messaged Henry, see what's going on with the new team, and he told me that day to have to make sell myself to him, kind of. Make like a document about the things I do, things of past teams, what I thought, how I could have solved the past team, or how I do anti-strats, just all that stuff, just generally like me as a person and as an analyst.
Yeah, almost like a job application in a way.
Yeah. So you told me like to do that, think it out, get it to him in like 5 days or so. But like, obviously in that time frame I didn't have much else to do, so I just wrote like 10 pages in like a day and just sent it to him the same day. I was like, yeah, I'm not very patient, here you go. And then yeah. So I think that maybe helps. And then obviously he had Kassad brought on board, and show Kassad. Kassad was, Kassad's a pretty chill guy, so Kassad was like, yeah, this works. And obviously I have a pretty good relationship with Alex once he was brought on board. I felt like it was especially mostly important that I'm on the same terms with Alex and Kassad more so than Henry, because Henry's just kind of going off their opinion of me. So you know so obviously Henry's choosing to keep me around for the end of the year, see how things go, and me having a pretty good relationship so far with Kassad and Alex, I think has been the main benefactor. I haven't had as much to do on this team so far, especially as it's like a new team and things are just getting built. So the players and the coaches themselves are still getting comfortable, and there's not really room for a seventh voice to be having a lot of impact. It just kind of fucks everything up, in my opinion, at least. So yeah, it's just a good relationship with Alex and Kassad mostly.
It's cool that we get a little bit of a window into the behind the scenes of how that whole conversation happened, though. One of the things that when I was interviewing Mahone not so long ago for discussing his relationship with NIP, as he's now been announced as their analyst, one of the things that we sort of learned about him was he doesn't have a huge amount of say necessarily on what strats the team employs. He doesn't even really communicate too heavily with the roster themselves. He more so communicates with the coach threat. But one of the things that he said that he was trying to do a bit more of was a bit more of not just anti-stratting the other rosters, but also trying to figure out how teams might anti-strat NIP itself. And I'm curious as to essentially your approach when it comes down to trying to come up with strategies for the team to run. Do you more so side on anti-stratting their opponents, or do you find it a nice balance between doing that and also assessing where the weaknesses are of the roster? I mean, obviously, only a few officials have been played, so it's hard to say for now. But what do you predict your sort of style of analysis and preparing that kind of breakdown? What do you predict that you're going to lean more towards one or the other? Do you think it'll be a nice even split, or will you be siding more on one side as opposed to the other?
It obviously depends, but yeah. Obviously on this team, because we have like Alex, Esatag, and Kassad, they're all, and Walks, like, they're all voices that have a lot of impact, how they want to play and stuff. So, I don't really have to have much say in, like, in terms of like the strats, we're gonna run or we're gonna implement into our own game. So I most sort of focus on, obviously anti-stratting, and obviously as time goes on and we play more officials, just looking at our own maps. And I think one thing I'm able to do is I kind of see the map in nades, smokes and mollies, and that's kind of how I see teams and how they're using those. And I feel like I generally have a pretty good overview of teams that have like a way that makes sense so far in terms of like how they're set up and how they're using their nades. And obviously, kind of like the same thing that Hohen said, anti-stratting your own team, making sure that what I'm seeing when I watch my own team and I watch playback, what makes sense. I'm looking for any tells that we have that we need to suss out. And if we have tells from one map, I might just say we can abuse the shit out of this. If this other team sees that and thinks it's going to be the same, just keep throwing the same thing and doing something different with it, right? And so you can do things like that. You can, just finding common spots that our players are currently playing, and pointing out to like our anchors, like they're going to see you playing here a lot. They're playing this type of setup or strat a lot. And based on, and sometimes based on what I see from the other team, I'll be like, this is probably how they're going to target us, or how they're going to like look to open the game, or what they're going to look to shut down. So yeah, just things like that. Especially as an analyst, it's just going along as the matches progress and continue, especially, and having impact that way, and kind of sussing out our weaknesses, things we can add or improve, and things our weaknesses that we can fix and then abuse in later matches.
Do you think the workflow will end up being something similar to what I was describing with the Mahone interview, where he's essentially funneling all of the information into Threat, and then the coach decides, oh, I guess I'll tell this to this player and this to that player, and like figuring out essentially how to disperse that? Do you think that's going to be something similar with the C9 roster here, where you're going to be passing that information to Kassad, or do you think some things are better left given directly to some of the players, depending on the situation?
Yeah, I'm generally confident in my own ability when I see things like that to, just join the team in server time, which at the moment is like 3 a.m. for me. But hey, server time. But I join in server time, and I can go over my own stuff and be like, these are like the things that I found, or things that other teams might see, just as like a general help for anybody else. I try not to say like these are things that like are bad and we need to fix. It's more like these are things that I see, and you can decide whether this is good or this is bad, or you keep it. What do you want to do with it, if it's anything important, type of thing.
As you alluded to just there, I mean, figuring out how to communicate the ideas in a way that is going to be the most productive, right? That is a puzzle unto itself. And one of the things I'm always curious about is when you consider how much information the average CS player needs to have in their head as they're executing an idea. They've got to remember whatever strat they're running, especially on T's side. They've also got to remember what to do if certain like things happen, like essentially some contingency plans, and also what their opponents are likely to do, so that they can kind of make all of those decisions. You can come up with like the Rain Man movie or whatever, where it's just all the math equations over his head as he's counting cards or something. So a lot of stuff is going on there, a lot of strats, a lot of memories they're going to have to commit to their brain. So I'm curious as to how you would approach essentially dispersing that information like we were just talking about. Like, is there ever a case where there's like more to say, but you've got to hold back or find another time to bring that topic up? Because we could continue down this one, how to play around this smoke, or what this team might be doing and what that team might be doing, and all these different things. Or like, how do you actually approach, like if you just had to give a sample strat to somebody, how would you actually approach giving it to them? And to what extent would you start to hold yourself back from going further down? Like, does it depend on the player? Like, some players obviously might have like more capacity to learn all that stuff and retain it, or like how do you make sure that everything that you're providing is useful in that sense?
Yeah, it kind of just goes off like when I do my notes, I kind of just have like a doc, and I have like A side, B side, certain things, and just kind of based on like it's not something I think about like too in depth, but I definitely, in terms of like how I structure my notes and how I structure, like I like color code certain things, or I have certain kind of like formats for certain things, to like easily distinguish, different types of things, different types of like tells or layouts or setups, what I'm trying to get across. I'm always like very careful in my notes about making sure I'm explaining things that are useful, but also not too complicated. Um, Things that are easy to understand and remember. And if there's anything more complicated, I'll just talk to Alex or Kasad about it and see what they think. Um, and yeah, there's definitely like and in terms of like when you're controlling, like say you're in server time and like people are too focused around a certain flash or a smoke, I think it's just up to the coach or someone to just be like, all right, it doesn't really matter, like just figure it out, just talk about it, and then let's move on. Just it's really just as simple as that. Just making sure people aren't getting too focused on something and just kind of keeping a wider vision of things and like the time you're wasting on certain things.
Yeah, what you just alluded to there too is like the idea of making sure that whatever you're imparting is essentially can be written, can be like told, and then there doesn't necessarily need to be a follow-up question or anything else that you have to like stop the flow of everything and answer on this
Mhm.
particular note. So I imagine that must play into it as well, as like finding a way to distill it into just a couple sentences that can be like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to say this. This guy knows what I'm talking about. Then I can say whatever I'm going to say for something else. We can move on to the next
Yeah.
topic. So
Yeah, it's a lot of like images and stuff. Like something I still remember, like an actually good piece of advice I got from MCE, who coaches Chaos, is that like I think he told me like when I was like first games, he's like, dude, remember players are fucking dumb. So use like pictures, make sure like explain stuff like as simple as you can, like that type of thing. Try not to be, too too wild with it, because players don't want to like read all that shit. So, getting your information across in an effective way is like a very important skill that is probably overlooked by some analysts.
yeah, the analyst should invest in making some coloring books or something
Yeah.
really low level. Yeah. So
Yeah, I literally just have things like color coded and like different bold text and italics and shit. Just random like color key shit.
makes sense. So one of the things that you also had broached the topic of before we got started on this interview, you said you wanted to talk a little bit about like essentially mental health in the scene, and I assume that there's going to be a bit of like North American bias or focus on this particular topic, since that's what you're more familiar with. But we alluded to a lot of it in the earlier stages of the interview. We were talking about player confidence in their roster and how they can move on from there. You also said that you wanted to talk a bit about your own like sort of personal experiences with it, and I imagine this has been something you've been thinking about a bit more. Everybody's been thinking about it a bit more since we're coming into winter on this hemisphere, and there's that seasonal depression that people get. We're also dealing with the fact that we're all in some form of a lockdown or another. There's all that like sort of psychic stress that people are experiencing just because the world's in a crazy position. So can you tell us a little bit more about what sort of thoughts you've been having on this particular topic and how you would characterize them?
Yeah, because it's like before I started this year, coaching in Poland and stuff. It feels like even like going like a few months back to now, like it's just a completely different person from starting therapy for like my depression and anxiety. Finding out, it's like high functioning autism is like kind of like the more distinct term, I guess. But, like figuring these things out, and like it just changes like your view of yourself and like your view of things so much, I feel like, and it just changes your perspective. And I think that's so important, maintaining that kind of like mindfulness and perspective of who you are and like why and like kind of how you tick and how you function, because that so many things go into like a good team other than just clicking heads, and but there's so much that goes in before that, and that starts with each individual player and their attitude, and kind of how they view themselves and how confident they are in themselves, and that starts from there, that bleeds into the team environment, that bleeds into their confidence, that bleeds into everything about a team. It bleeds into it starts from the individual and how they're feeling. And so I feel like it's often overlooked, especially because you don't want to maybe give your opponents an advantage knowing that you're like feeling like that type of thing. You don't want to give them like that like mental edge at times. And so players, I think, kind of at times overlook it in themselves, or just say, oh, I can just go deathmatch more, or I just play more, it'll sort itself out. And really overlooking like how much of a factor that plays into it. Because just personally, like I feel like a totally, literally, completely different person from a few months ago, and I just feel like there's a lot of pros, especially that maybe have issues, controlling anger, issues controlling their attitudes and teams, that I think are looking over a very important aspect and tool in mental health and therapy, and I think literally every single pro player, 100% of them, could benefit from doing like therapy. Beyond just like a sports psychologist, someone they they know, like a therapist that they know they like literally everyone could benefit from that. So it's just something I touched on. I felt like I wasn't getting enough credit for how important and how much it can help someone.
Well, it's a big sort of maybe less so now, but especially even if you just go back a year or so ago, there was a certain stigma around it before essentially people became a bit more aware of things. And I think another thing to point out is you mentioned high functioning autism, and that's actually I think more and more people are going to be coming to find out that they are somewhere on
Oh
that
yeah,
spectrum.
definitely.
You know what I mean?
There's definitely like pros, like more pros than they know that are on that spectrum. Like a lot of people that don't actually realize or haven't put two and two together in terms of like some of the issues they've had in the past. It's like what I did. It's like once I kind of figured out, or Niteris kind of started to talk about high functioning autism, how it might affect me. I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of fucking sense actually. Like just in terms of like the past 20 years of my life and I've interacted with people, I was like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Just like a lot of people that could benefit a lot from like learning something about that for themselves, how they tick.
Yeah, I mean the worry that maybe some people would have, and maybe some people who have clued in enough to know that maybe they do fit some of the bill of the symptoms or whatever the list of characteristics are, and maybe they would potentially place them on that. But I mean, some people might apply too much of a stigma to the label itself. Like if somebody
Mhm.
finds out that they have depression, or somebody finds out that they have whatever ailment they might have, or just a different sort of way of functioning in the world, is some people are going to assume that that makes them a lesser person, or that's another angle for their somebody to get an advantage, like you alluded to. If you know that a certain player is struggling with depression or struggling with something else, it would be pretty fucked up of you to do. But in theory, that could be weaponized against that player, and so maybe that's another reason why they would want to find another excuse essentially not to investigate it, because then if they know, or if they speak out about it, even regardless of whether or not they know, which obviously can be a pretty big advantage for them themselves, just to get it off their shoulders, to sort of get that weight off their chest. If they talk about it a bit more, we've seen more and more twitlongers about this sort of stuff. But maybe that's another excuse that they'll make. They'll say, oh well, if I do that, if I speak out about it, then this might be used against me in some way.
Yeah, it's like there's used to be like a lot of stigmas that like I can definitely test for that. Being scared of being having the stigma of being depressed, or having depression, being autistic. Another thing I found out through therapy was being asexual. Like all these like different like labels and stigmas and stuff, like just like random shit that I definitely can see why people are afraid of. But I feel like once you kind of discover them, and like you go through this and you figure out, oh, it's just kind of who you are, and it doesn't really change who you are. It just gives you a better view of like how you tick and how you can change these things, and how you can have more direct impact over yourself, and understanding yourself a lot more. I feel like it helped me get over that fear. It made me feel that like, oh, this is actually knowing all these things is actually really good for me. And it kind of feels like the previous almost like 21 years before that is like almost like just a build up to understanding like who you are now, kind of type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, pros would probably love to say that, oh, I'm really good at one tapping, but I have bad spray control, so let me work on that. Like, that's understanding a strength and a weakness, characteristics
Hmm.
that you have. But when it comes to the mental game, very
Hmm.
few of them are interested in conceptualizing it like that, or even thinking about it at all. Perhaps because they
Yeah.
believe that it can't be attenuated or carried at any way, there's just something completely out of their control, when in reality, if you know something about yourself, you can then do something differently based on that knowledge. Like that can be an empowering
And it
tool
just
for you.
yeah, it just gives you more confidence understanding yourself and understanding yourself, like how you tick, how you travel, like when you're traveling, like, especially in a job like as a pro player, when you're traveling as much as you are, and like you have as much social media impact on you, and there's so many people looking at you and judging your every move as a player, and your stats, everything like that. Just having that kind of outlet just can be so beneficial to literally everyone. Not just people that are struggling, but even people that are even doing fine now. Eventually, that can change. It just helps you to continually maintain and manage those types of things. Just meeting with someone, or putting any type of effort into meditation, mindfulness, things like that. Um, just really has such a huge impact, and like a huge positive impact, that I don't think enough people. It's obviously getting better. Obviously, it's a thing that's been improving continuously, but still something that I think a lot more players in general could be taking use of.
Well, something that you just sort of alluded to there is that even players or support staff, or whoever they may be in the industry, pretty much everybody alive, even if they're succeeding, they're finding some sort of success in the field that they're working within. If they don't know why they're finding that success, or they don't know
Mhm.
all there is to know about what might be contributing towards it, then if that success ever drops off, they're going to be up shit's creek, not really knowing how to go back to what was making them giving them the success, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
some elements are going to be out of their control. Like, I mean, obviously, if you think back to like the crazy 87-0 streak that NIP went on, if you conceptualize it like that, like part of that was out of their control because the competition was just lower caliber, right? So like they weren't playing against teams that could beat them. That is a some part of how they were able to elevate their game to that level and find that streak is because they were simply in some ways simply better than their opponents. And obviously once their opponents get better, that achievement falls away, that strength falls away. So understanding what else contributed to that might have allowed them to continue the streak or start another streak back up or something like that, had they understood it a little bit more. Do you have any examples or anything that comes to mind of like when essentially, I mean, obviously choking is a big example, I guess, as an abstract concept, but any sort of example where you think mental health was a limiting factor of a certain player's performance or a certain team's performance, and then you were able to see when they conquered it or how they sort of worked around it and were able to subvert it into something to achieve greatness in a different light? Like, can you think of any particular examples that sort of speak to you specifically, that maybe something that actually inspired you to go on this journey of like learning more about yourself in the first place, or was it even related to gaming in that sense?
I don't know if there's any like particular instance I can think of that I would relate it to. I'm sure there's like one if I really think about like someone that kind of overcame that and really helped them. Um, I think one particular instance actually is this actually isn't CS related, but kind of like one reason I started really looking into therapy was like I got really big into like Formula One this past year, and I remember I was like watching the Netflix series and hearing one of the Has drivers, Roman Grosjean, talk about how he was someone that had like a lot of difficulties with crashing and like he's like crashing a lot and he was just having a lot of struggles in terms of the community pressure put on him by that, and people obviously are going to give you shit for that, kind of becoming a meme. And he talked about how he started doing therapy because if you train your body so much, why would you not train your mind just as much, like when it's such an important aspect. And so it wasn't CS related, but that type of thing, coming from any kind of sports person really stuck with me. It's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, especially for someone in my job, a coach or an analyst, like you need to train your mind. Like you need to, like there's so much that you don't know about your mind, or like so many things that are like, especially before then, like that I just didn't know or didn't understand. And like it's such an important thing to understand those things. And it's like kind of putting it in that kind of phrasing, like if you people so much work into you're training your aim or training your CS game, why would you not put a similar amount of work into training your mind when it's things like confidence and self-confidence are so important in a game, with really defining factors.
Yeah, I think people are just in general starting to see more of a connection between body and mind, because obviously the people who grew up like myself as a nerd, I didn't take care of my body at all, and I was like, oh yeah, whatever, I'm smart, so it'll be fine. And then eventually you come to realize, oh wait, there's a little bit more to it than that. Like if I exercise, I'm happier. If I
Mhm.
if I keep care of my body, then there's going to be less to worry about mentally as well. Like that's going to relieve some stress, which allows me to think even better, or elevate my sort of mental game even further. So I think people in general, like, that is catching on as a sort of trend, if you want to call it that. Our understanding is growing in that respect. So I was curious if you have any sort of predictions or like a positive outlook in general on the trajectory that people are going on in this respect. Like especially in esports, people have talked about playing for way too long, like the ridiculous training hours sometimes. On the flip side, some people would say they're not motivated enough and they don't put any hours into the game. So it doesn't seem like there's a happy medium historically that's been like a precedent. Basically, we've either had too little or too much. It seems for most of CS's history, at least from what I can remember. So could you speak to anything that you see as like a promising trend upward, going up in that sense?
Um, I think it's been on a promising trend the past couple of years or so. More teams getting like sports psychologists and stuff. Like even on our past team, it's like it's nice to have a sports psychologist that talks to the team as a general, but can also have one-on-ones with people. It's not the same as having your own individual like therapist maybe, but that does help talk to things. Talk to someone that knows the space and can help you out with things like that. Um, and I think another important thing is just more people realizing like everything is a spectrum, like in terms of like how much you need to DM, or like how much you need to play, or like you know how much focusing on your mental health is good for you, or like certain things. Just like there's no like one size fits all things for for all these things. It's like finding what's comfortable for you. And I think it's more that case of that, like making like pointing out to people that it's not so much like an A or B set type of thing in terms of what they need to do to succeed, but it's about finding out what fits you. And what that's another part of figuring out your own mind is like, okay, what routines fit me, what just just everything. It's hard to describe like exactly what I'm trying to say, but trying to not be so set about everything and trying to explore more about what can make them productive in their own fields.
So if we were to try to tie this back to the coaching angle that we talked about a bit at the beginning of the interview, I'm curious as to essentially how you would try to do some sort of setup in that sense for the players themselves. Like, do you think that there would be something that you would want to impart as far as a system goes? If you were say you're a coach of a roster, say you're replacing Kassad, we'll go crazy. Well, say you're coach of new C9 roster. How would you go about like essentially having these players make sure that they're like not only maintaining their aim and their skills in the game, but also their mind and body outside of the game? And how do you think you would go about trying to convince players that that is a real significant thing that they should be doing, something that is to aspire towards?
For me, it would be less about, I wouldn't want to like impose like a system or anything. I don't think like forcing people to do something like that would be necessarily the case. But for me, it would be more just about monitoring, individual players, because I feel like I can read their attitudes and their general vibes from day to day pretty well. I think that's part of like maybe like an autistic thing. It's not something that comes natural to you, so I kind of have to read more into it. Kind of how people are speaking, things like that.
Yeah.
So like kind of just keeping my tabs on that from each person, and if I see someone struggling, or see someone maybe they could benefit, they're kind of having some struggles with this, just talking to them and talking about like my own experiences, and how how it helped me so much, and how maybe it could help you, and just not like pressuring them to do it, but like saying like I think this is like a big part, and I think this is something that could help you, and I just want you to consider it, look into it. I'm not saying you have to do it or anything, but like recommend it and try to almost like guide them towards it, and try to make it so that it's more their own thing that they're seeking out, though. I don't want it to be me finding a therapist for them or something, or like getting them the mental help. I want them to be something that they seek out, more information about themselves, and it's kind of like a path that they naturally go down, because maybe I kind of notice, and I kind of nudge them on, as like I had similar issues, like I've had all these struggles myself, and he's like some things that have helped me, and I know have helped other people in the scene. So yeah, and encouraging them to talk to other players that have gone through similar things, and could help them that way.
Have you received pushback when you're having these sorts of conversations? Like people who are like, I don't need that. That's not really that big of a deal. Like, have you had to like fight through some of the common excuses that people might say that in a sense, do you think you've been successful in doing that? Like getting these
Yeah,
people to actually take it
I
a
think
bit more seriously?
yeah, I think the most common one is like, um obviously, like if you try to like encourage people to like like therapy or something, just something to help them out a little bit, they kind of say like, oh, maybe you tried it before and it didn't help, or like when they were younger or a kid, or did something that didn't help. Trying to encourage them that it's something that changes over time, and it's like a thing. It's like everyone is like, all medications are different, all like therapists are different, like all these different types of things are different. They're gonna fit different people, and so just look further into like the kind of things that, think about like the type of things that would help you. I think it's like a kind of a tough thing to really digress like that, but yeah, just encouraging people like that.
Well, it's certainly sometimes a difficult thing to say because especially if they've already tried it, sometimes they have made up their mind that
Yeah,
it didn't cure every single problem instantly in the first couple of visits.
yeah.
So why would I continue doing it? It's the
Mm.
solutionism, I guess, where people,
Yeah, solutionism. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
they apply
people are
too
too
much.
focused on, the A or B. They're too focused on having the set thing that works now. Figuring out, but it's a process. It's the process of figuring out everything that goes on in your mind. For me, it was just like, for me, the way I did it, it was just writing down random thoughts I was having throughout the day in between meetings with my therapist. Right, it's just writing down certain things or thoughts I had just about certain habits that I have about drinking certain things, or eating certain things, or certain habits that I had, and just writing all these things down and understanding them, maybe like have to learn so much about myself. Just things that I never thought about before. Influences that I never thought about before from past experiences. Really just helped me get an actual grasp on like kind of how I function as a person, which is invaluable, and especially in a space like esports, it's so competitive.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, you're comparing yourself to other people, not always comparing yourself to who you were a year ago or
Yeah,
something like
yeah,
that. So
yeah.
I'm curious as to how you would sort of recontextualize the time that you spent on eUnited or the time that you spent on Space Station or on Rogue, where you're dealing with all these different characters, all these different personality types, and obviously they're responding to challenges in different ways. Do you think that there's any particular player, or I mean, you don't necessarily have to drop their name if you don't want to, but any particular personalities where you saw like some of the things that we've been talking about here in action? Like maybe some of them were more or less receptive to conceptualizing things mentally, or was it just not a conversation that was had back in the day? What would you say to that as far as like some of the past experiences you've had looking at it through this lens?
Yeah, I don't think I've been in a position yet where I really had to have that much of a say, and that much, like kind of like head coach say, where I want to be, where it's my place to be like super involved, in, people's mental health and stuff. Um, obviously there's a certain step where I don't want to overstep my boundaries as like an analyst or assistant coach at times, but there's definitely certain players that I can easily see that are struggling with things like that, being comfortable in their own skin, or they go to lands and they're just upset at like random things that don't really matter, just super gets into their head and it's like super affects them in a match, and I can just tell. Or certain players that I can tell go to LAN and don't and seem to really overthink everything instead of just playing the game. I can definitely see that in certain players, and having that experience of seeing those types of players and also seeing the players that I think can do it a bit better. Maybe someone like Floppy who kind of just who's able to a bit better just kind of get on with things. And, especially at a LAN, he's able to perform his settings because he's naturally just changing his mouse pad 30 times a day. But yeah, it helps me to see like the certain players in the past, like MSL, that would just get on with things, and I could tell seem to be in a very stable place mentally, very confident in themselves, and other players that I felt like struggle a bit more with figuring out where they are and figuring out their own self confidence. And so I definitely United and Rogue having those two teams back to back kind of showed me two distinct different types of teams. One that functioned well and was making progress and was playing more than the sum of its parts, and another team that wasn't able to reach its potential because it almost seemed like they didn't care to, or they didn't understand how to, and didn't care to understand how to do that. If that makes sense.
No, that's another lesson as well that you might be able to take from it too. Is that trying to make the most of whatever opportunity you have now might lead into you having another opportunity in the future, and then being able to compare then contrast those two opportunities that you had, like you're talking about with the United and Rogue. You're going to probably see some very different things between those two examples. And I think the same is true for pretty much anybody else. Like somebody who gets picked up for one team or gets picked up for one broadcast or whatever the time, the type of work that they might be doing, coaching one roster or analyzing for one organization. Managing something like that, and comparing that to whatever they do a year from now, assuming they're in the same space, they're probably going to be able to see it's. Maybe some people are essentially trapped in feeling like this is the only thing that they're going to do, or this is everything because it's right now, and they can't look to maybe how things are going to evolve in the future, right? Because what you're talking about is essentially like you got to see the bad end of where a team can even implode in terms of roster management or anything like that based on the psychological aspect versus somebody who's a stable leader in MSL coming into Rogue. So you have a very different sort of take just back to back, like you're saying. That's probably more true for more people than maybe they conceptualize it the same way. So they might be stuck thinking like maybe you were in the moment. You might be able to speak to that a little bit more as well. Like in the middle of a United, did it feel like it was just going to never get better, or things were always going to be like that in NA?
It was actually such like a useful case to have in my experience for a team, because it wasn't a team that just imploded because the personalities didn't mesh, or people didn't like each other. People on the team liked each other. Everyone was friends. Obviously I didn't fit in like quite as much as the others, because as the analyst or whatever, kind of like the seventh man, I only fit in with like certain people really. But like but like United was a team that I could see from like, I think my final straw that I kind of saw on the team was like once Moose left and they picked up Freakazoid instead of going for Floppy. Once they kind of made that move and I saw the results in New York, and it still seemed like they were just going to make me keep working with A2Z instead of making me the coach. And so I felt like this team, even though they were sticking together, I was like, this team is never going to get any results past this point. Like, I don't see a point in sticking around. So I left my salary for just doing prep. It's like an easy salary to go work for ATK for free for a few months, because I saw the long term. I saw, okay, I leave United now, a team that I see absolutely no future in, and I'm going to assess my options for the rest of the year. And for now, I'm just going to work with ATK for free, get some experience, because I think this team could go farther in the future. And, just lining up to work with them with ATK, this is before anything with C9 was even, on the table or anything, just leads me to a spot with C9, looking at the long term team, leads me to an assistant coach spot in C9, now leads me to being in a team with Kassad and Alex and Woxic, all these people, like, looking at the long term instead of just looking at, the now. understanding where things are going to go, and kind of understanding the direction of certain teams, and being able to understand based on the attitudes and the influences in the team whether you think that team is going to be capable of going higher. On United, I said they're not going to. I just straight up felt like they're not going to be able to go any higher. This is like the level they're going to reach because they don't understand how to get higher than here. So I left it for a more promising team.
As we look towards the future now, I'm curious if you can sort of do the same sort of thing. Like, what kind of decisions do you think you're going to have to make in the next year or so? Obviously, you said you're kept on till the end of the year for C9, so presumably that'll be what accounts for it. But this time next year, do you think you'll have made another smart decision that secures your future for the future, or what do you think? Obviously, it's a really tough question to answer, but curious as to your mindset, like what you've been thinking about for your future in the esports space.
Yeah, at the moment, I think it's more just working with this team, working with Alex and Kassav for the foreseeable future. I feel like I'm able to learn so much just by working with people and just seeing how they function. Like, it's how I learned so much from Rogue and MSL. Like, it's not like MSL was like teaching me things or anything. I was just, you show up for practice, you see how they do things, you see how they conduct themselves, and you just kind of take after them. And so just kind of continuing to do that for the next while. I try not to have too many far set plans in esports. Obviously things can change so drastically.
Difficult industry to do that in, yeah.
Yeah, but in the current case and like kind of where I am at mentally and like kind of what I want to keep doing, I think at the moment it's just kind of continuing on this path with C9. As the analyst, I think it's a pretty good spot for me at the moment. Working with all these players, is learning so much. Continuing to be in a team with Floppy is really good for me. He's one of my best friends. It's really it's another positive aspect, a really positive aspect for me mentally to have someone like that in a team with me. So yeah, for now it's just continuing in this team, continuing to make progress with my mental health, continuing to make progress with the team, and CS skills, and just waiting. I'm only 21 still, and I figure most of the coaches are a bit older than that. So I figure I have time to kind of sit down and learn some things before I eventually take out my first coaching shot, whenever that will be.
As we approach the end of the interview, do you have anything sort of final to say on all the different topics we've touched on? Any sort of final message for all of your diehard viewers, and especially Montu, who you picked over Ziwu?
Montu, thanks for following me back like a year ago when I was on eUnited. I always appreciate that. I knew Montu before he was on OG. Oh, I knew his talent. I didn't know him, but so that's how I'm legit. I know what's going on. Mantu over Ziwu, and yeah, just thanks to Cloud9 and sponsors and stuff. And thanks to everyone for supporting me. On Twitter, YouTube, whatever. It's server time. Check out at server time, Patreon, and yeah, that's about it.